Hi, I'm Lisa from Australian travel and migration blog dreamingofdownunder.com, and today I'm going to share my tips on flying during the pandemic. I live in Australia, but I've just been to the UK for a visit for a few weeks, and unfortunately I got COVID quite near the start and I had to spend most of it isolating, and then I couldn't get my flight home because I was still positive and I had a lot of trouble rebooking my flight. So I just wanted to share all the things that you should look into before booking a flight and all the things that I did wrong and how I finally got back to Australia. I made one of these videos in 2020 after I got stuck in the UK for a few months and how I got back to Australia, but things are really different now. We've got COVID tests and vaccines and most of the countries have opened their borders now. So here are my top tips for flying during the pandemic. So for all these things that you need to check, make sure you go onto official government websites for the countries. Don't just look on media reports because the rules change really quickly. Just in a few weeks before I flew, I kept a spreadsheet with links in and screenshots and things of things I needed to know, and it changed quite a few times just within a few weeks before flying. So the first thing to check is obviously that you're actually allowed to leave your country and that you'll be allowed to come back in. So for example, Australia has had its international borders closed for almost 2 years and was only allowing citizens and permanent residents into the country, and also even we weren't allowed to go abroad unless we had an exemption from the government, so it was just like compassionate reasons, funerals and things like that. Check that your country allows you to go to the country you want to go to and it's not too high risk, and check the country you want to go to will allow visitors from your country. So it might be called a red list. They might have a list of countries that you're not allowed to visit from. Number 2 is to look into what vaccination status you need. So for the country you want to go to, check if they require you to be vaccinated. It might be that if you're not vaccinated, you have to go into hotel quarantine. That's what you have to do in Australia, and that's quite expensive. It's about $3,000. Check their definition of fully vaccinated. It can be 2 doses, it could be 3 doses, it could be that your final dose had to be within a certain time frame, and also check which countries they accept vaccination passports for. So when I went to the UK, I think they had a list of countries and Australia was on there, so they will accept official vaccination passports from those countries. So with your vaccination passport with Australia, this is something you get when you log into your Medicare account via MyGov. So you can download that. You'll want to have it saved onto your phone as a PDF so you can show them at the airport. I would also print it out just to be careful. I didn't do that, but a lot of people did, so I would make sure you've got 2 copies of it. Number 3 is to check if the country you're going to requires you to take a pre-departure test before you leave. So normally it will specify if this needs to be a PCR or if it can be a rapid antigen test. So rapid antigen tests, which are called RATs in Australia, or lateral flow tests, they are actually the same thing. I was really confused until I went to the UK because we just call them RATs here. So it may be that you're allowed to take a rapid antigen test, but it has to be medically supervised, and you might need a certain type of certificate with specific information on. So normally you can't just go and get a free government test. You need to pay for it and have a proper certificate. Number 4 is to check if you need an arrival test when you get to the country. With the UK, I think they've scrapped this now, but I had to go onto a list of suppliers that were on the government website and order a rapid antigen test to take at home that was sent to the address where I was staying, and then when I ordered it they gave me a special code, and before I went to the UK I had to fill in a passenger declaration form online, and I had to enter that code onto the form to prove that I'd really bought one. Number 5 is to check whether the airline and any country that you might be transiting in have any requirements. So transit is when you change planes somewhere but you don't actually leave the airport, you just stay inside there. When I flew from Australia to the UK, I flew with Qatar Airways via Doha, and they didn't have any requirements, and Doha airport was really busy and everyone was just wandering around freely. But when I came back, because I had to book a different flight, I came via Singapore with BA and Qantas, and Singapore were really strict, so I had to have had a pre-departure test before getting on the flight, had to be fully vaccinated, and they wanted proof that I would be able to get the connecting flight to Australia. So basically they don't want you getting stranded in their country and potentially having COVID. And to transit in Singapore you had to have a connecting flight with a list of specific airlines, so because I was with Qantas that was okay. And inside Singapore airport as well, it was quite strict. Instead of letting you wander around, they put everyone from the flight who was transiting in a kind of big lounge together that no one else was allowed in, and you could order food from like a QR code on the wall, and they had vending machines, and then they let us out a couple of hours before the flight. But we had to wear these wristbands that meant that we weren't allowed to buy things in shops. I went into a shop with a girl that I made friends with, and this lady came over and said, no, you can't buy anything in here, you've got a green wristband on, and just pointed at a sign outside the shop. So I don't know why, I don't know if it's because the UK is a high risk country or something, you're not supposed to be wandering in the shops, but anyway, we had to have a green ribbon on our wrists. With Australia, it's quite difficult because all I've got is an electronic visa, I don't have an ID card or anything like that. So she wanted proof at check-in in Heathrow that I could get into Australia, and all I could show her was the email when I got my visa granted, and she seemed quite confused about that. I had the same thing when I flew in 2020 and I was going via Hong Kong. I had to stand at check-in for an hour, and they actually rang Canberra to check that I really had a visa and I would really be able to get the flight to Australia from Hong Kong. Number 6 is to check what you will need to do if you get COVID abroad. So don't just assume you won't get it and hope for the best. Really look into what you'll have to do in that country. So I'd probably pack some rapid antigen tests if you can, just so you can test yourself if you're getting symptoms. I caught COVID near the start of the trip. I didn't get it on the plane. I got it from a family member, who came to visit on the first day I was there. I was staying with my parents, but I was the last person to get it, so I think they caught it first and I got it from them. So by the time I'd actually tested positive, I'd already isolated for nearly a week because we were all coming down with it. So check how long you'll need to isolate for. In the UK, you isolate for a maximum of 10 days, but on the 5th day, you can start taking a daily test at home, and if you're negative 2 days in a row, you can stop isolating. Unfortunately, I was positive for almost 2 weeks. What I would really recommend doing if you do get COVID abroad is to go and get a PCR with the government so that you've got a record of when you actually got COVID, because otherwise you can't prove how long you've had it for. And also check whether you need to register it with their government, if you can do that online. Tip number 7 is to make sure you check whether you will need to take a pre-departure test before you fly back to your home country and how you're going to get that. So this is the really big thing that I did wrong. I must have looked at the requirements to fly into New South Wales specifically and gone onto the New South Wales government website, and that tells you what to do when you arrive back in New South Wales. But I didn't realise there is separate requirements on the federal government website for anyone coming into Australia countrywide. So that's where it said you need a pre-departure test. So because it didn't mention pre-departure tests on the website I went onto for New South Wales, I just thought that meant we didn't need to have one. And unfortunately, a few days before I flew back, I thought I'll just have another check. And I googled, international arrivals in Australia, and then I just saw everyone must have a pre-departure test. And I was like, oh no, because I was still testing positive. So I had the choice of either a PCR within 72 hours of flying or a rapid antigen test within 24 hours of flying. So from what I've read and from what the nurses told me in the test centre, PCRs are more sensitive and they're more likely to be positive for a longer time. So my only option really was to take a rapid antigen test. So in the UK, they call these fit to fly tests, and they've got loads of centres where you can have them. I had mine at Birmingham Airport with Express Test, I think it was, and that cost £35, and the results are back within 40 minutes. So I went to get the test on the morning, the day before I was flying, and I told the nurse that I was a bit worried because I'd had COVID, and she looked at the results after like 30 seconds and said, oh, it's negative, you're going home. So I went back home and the results were emailed through. Thankfully I logged in and read them properly because it said positive. I didn't really know what to do, so I contacted the test centre just in case there'd been a mix-up, and the manager said, well, they take 25 minutes to develop, so I don't know why she said that so quickly. And she did say that she'd seen my test and it was an extremely faint line, and I would probably be negative in a couple of days. So look into certificate of recovery. So in this situation, if you're still testing positive but you're not contagious anymore and you should be allowed to fly, you can get what's called a certificate of recovery. So in the UK, you can order these online from private doctors, and you have to state that you don't have symptoms anymore. I did have symptoms quite badly at that point, actually worse than at the beginning. I barely had a voice. They cost about £80 to £100. But the problem I had was you need to have a PCR result to prove to them when you first got COVID, and I only did a test at home, so I just couldn't prove it at all, so I couldn't take that option. So when I got the fit to fly test result back, it said we are obliged to tell the government and you must isolate for 10 days and that you must take a PCR test. So I thought if my only option is to get one of these certificate of recoveries, if I don't test negative, I'm going to need to go and get a PCR as soon as I can to start that 7-day process, because you have to have had COVID for at least a week to get that certificate. So I went and got a government test that afternoon, and then the rest of the day I just had to try and sort out what I could do. So I rang the NHS, which is what the test centre had told me to do. They said, even though you've already had COVID for that long, we can't backdate it on the system, so it's going to show as, you know, you've only just got COVID, which was so annoying. And my dad spoke to someone from the NHS. So the NHS is the National Health Service in the UK, and somebody told my dad that because I was British and using a British passport, that meant that I would have a 10-day travel ban on me. And he said if you were from another country it'd be fine, but even if you're kind of not in isolation anymore, you're just not going to be allowed to board a flight, because it's going to show when you try and check in. So that was really, really worrying. And then the woman I spoke to at the NHS told me to call the Australian Embassy. So I called the Australian Embassy, and they were like, we can't override the NHS and their rules because that's the law, so we can't really help you. Why don't you call the airline? So I looked up Heathrow Airport and called Qatar Airways. They were just totally unhelpful and just said, we just asked for whatever the country you're going to asked for, basically. So I really just wanted to know if there was going to be some kind of thing on my passport that would come up, but they didn't know. So the next thing I had to do was try and change my flight. So it was now kind of late afternoon, evening, and I was supposed to fly at about 8 o'clock the next morning. So I went onto the manage my booking thing. I'd booked through British Airways. I was allowed to change my flight without paying a fee, but I was supposed to pay the fare difference if the flights had gone up more. And the ones I was with, the Qatar flights, had gone up about $700, which was so annoying. I tried to change it online, it just wouldn't work. So I rang the call centre, and she looked at some flights for me in 10 days time, because I just thought I'm going to have to do another 10 days. I'm not going to be able to fly. And then she couldn't get the fares up, and she said, I'll call you back. She didn't call me back, and it was the evening, so their call centre's closed, so I couldn't call them. I really didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I would be charged for being a no-show at the airport the next morning. So I tried calling Qatar again at Heathrow Airport. I don't know if that puts you through to the actual airport. It was just the number on their website. They were just totally unhelpful. I gave them the booking reference. She was just like, no, nothing's coming up, sorry, bye. Just virtually hung up on me. So I just had to leave it for the night and go to bed, like really, really worried. So the next morning I called British Airways as soon as the offices opened at 8. I mean, the flight was going at 8:20, so, you know, there was nothing I could do about that. So she was really apologetic that nobody had called me back the day before. And then she said, oh, did you say you got COVID? And I was like, yeah. And then she said, well, you don't have to pay the fare difference then. We can do it for free as long as you can prove you got COVID. So it was a really good job that she didn't call me back the night before, because I probably would have paid something like $700 when I didn't actually need to. So she kept me on the call. I had to email my positive fit to fly certificate to her manager. She verified it. I was on hold for ages while they did this. And then she said, what you need to do now is, when you can get a negative fit to fly, email that back to us, and then we can rebook your flight, and then you won't have to pay anything. So that was a bit of a relief. My PCR result came back that morning. That was positive, which wasn't a surprise. So I made sure I registered that with the government to do it properly. Thankfully, it let me backdate the symptoms by 5 days, which meant that in this new kind of official isolation period, I was already on day 6. So at that point, you can start taking tests at home every day. So I took a test, it was negative. So I took the fit to fly test 1 day before I would have been negative. And then if I took one the next day and that was negative, that would end this isolation. But it still didn't end this like 10-day period where I was supposed to be banned from flying. I did much more research on the NHS and flying and everything. And then I realised that when he said because I was a British citizen and that meant that I wouldn't be able to fly, he must have assumed that I was using an NHS COVID pass. So that's the British vaccine passport. So they become invalid for 10 days. So I wouldn't have been able to fly. Thankfully, I used an Australian one, so I think that just didn't apply to me, and I should be fine to fly whenever I was negative, basically. So then the next day, which was a Wednesday, I took another test at home, which was also negative, so I was officially out of this new isolation that I was in, even though I'd had COVID for 2 weeks. So I really needed to fly by Friday morning at the latest, because I had some jobs starting in Australia. It was now Wednesday. The problem that you've got is when you fly, you have to have had the rapid antigen test within 24 hours before. So I needed to take a test, get a negative result, email it to British Airways, call them, rebook a flight, get to Heathrow on a coach, which takes 2.5 hours, and fly, within a 24-hour period. And bearing in mind it was now Wednesday and Storm Eunice was due on Friday, which was really, really dangerous and like ripped the roof off the O2 apparently. We were told that you're not meant to travel on that day at all unless you absolutely had to. So I wanted to try and fly on the Thursday. So there was a British Airways flight going on the Thursday night via Singapore, and so I decided I would really try and get that one. I rebooked my coach to go on the Thursday lunchtime, which would get me there in time. And then I booked another fit to fly for Thursday morning at 10 a.m, which meant if I couldn't get that evening flight, I could still get the Qatar ones the next morning, which were like 8 or 9 o'clock. So I'd be within the 24-hour window. So next day, took the fit to fly test. That was negative. Emailed it to British Airways, called them up, and they were like, oh, no, it has to be verified. We can't rebook you until like another department have done this. And he said, call back in a few hours, but it might take a whole day. And I was like, oh my gosh, I need to fly. Like I wanted to fly tonight, and they just wouldn't help me at all. So I didn't know what to do. I had about an hour window at this point before the coach was leaving. I was in a total panic. My family were in a panic. I just decided the best thing was to just get to Heathrow because of this storm the next day. If I couldn't fly, then I would just have to stay in a hotel. So I'd just have to get on the coach and try and book it on the way or when I got there. So I got on this coach. I started trying to ring BA like before I arrived. Normally they just put you on hold for like 20 minutes and then you get through, but it was so busy it just kept saying sorry, we're too busy, and it would just cut the call off, so I couldn't even get put on hold. I got to the airport, it came in a little bit late. I got there at 4 o'clock. The flight I wanted to get was at 6:50. So I went in, tried to look for a British Airways help desk. There wasn't one. I just asked a lady that was standing on like near one of the checkouts, and she gave me a different number to call because I said I couldn't get through. So I rang that. I was on hold for probably 15 minutes. I got through, and again she just said, oh, have you had an email saying that your certificate's been verified? We can't do anything otherwise. So she said she'd at least have a look at my account, and just as I was giving her all my details, the call just randomly cut off. And I met another girl on the flight who said she'd had to call 20 times to rebook hers because it just kept cutting off on her, or it just wouldn't even put her on hold. So I went up to another person and just explained what had happened and said, please, can you help me? Like, can you put me on a flight yourself? And they were just like, oh, yeah, sure. So everyone had already checked in. It was probably like an hour and a half or something until the flight was going, or 2 hours. So I just stood with the check-in girl, and she was like, when do you want to fly? And I was like, now. She said, have you got all your documents? Like, yeah, I'm ready to go. Please put me through. So she started putting it through. I had to go onto manage my booking account. She'd put the flight on, and then I had to try and upload like my vaccine certificate and my fit to fly certificate. She was calling Singapore, asking them that like if they'd accept me. So I had to pay another £100 and something, which was fine just because it was a different route from my original one. My documents just wouldn't upload onto BA. I think maybe the file size was too big or something, but I couldn't really change that on my phone. So then a supervisor had to get involved, and she had to do the documents manually. She had this huge chart, which I guess had like countries and documents and what everybody needed. So I had to go to another desk, and then we were trying to do it really quickly, and she was like, vaccine certificate, and I was showing her, and then like fit to fly certificate, and I was showing her, and then I was having to do things online because Australia you have to do a digital passenger declaration before you go. Thankfully I'd already started it, because you have to set up an account and log in and everything, but I had to put my flight details on, so I couldn't finish it. So then she was asking me for stuff. I was like, what's the flight number? And trying to put it all in, and then I gave it to her, and then she noticed there was another section that I hadn't done, the health declaration. So I was going through all this really important stuff, and it said, if you do not answer correctly, you will get fined and you might go to prison. And I was just really doing it fast and like looking at the clock over the checkout, trying to make sure I did it properly. Got it done. We got to the check-in. The check-in girl did stuff and then was like, oh, it's just not working. It won't let me do it. So the supervisor had to do something else and go to another desk, and she had to override stuff, and I was just like watching this clock, and then the check-in staff were just having a conversation like, oh, you going out tonight? Yeah. And I was just like, oh my God. And then finally she came over, she got a boarding pass, she'd just done everything, and she was like, have you got your phone? Have you got your passport? Have you got everything? And I was like, yeah. And then she just ran through to departures, had I think probably less than an hour, got through. It was one way you have to go to the gate and then get on a bus, so I had to get there quite early. I couldn't believe I'd got on. I just like rang my family. I was like, I'm on it, I'm going there. Because my sister had been looking into hotels when I was on the coach, just in case I had to stay there. I just couldn't relax until I really got there. I was like, someone's going to stop me, there's going to be something wrong. But I got in after like 2.5 weeks of isolation, and I made it back to Australia. Yay! Had the strictest biosecurity I've ever had. Got sniffer dogged. Everyone had to put their luggage down in a pile, and the sniffer dogs went over it, and I was the only person who wasn't like smuggling in sausages or weird leaves. It was like one of those border security programs. It was ridiculous. I had a bit of chocolate, that was fine. Check if you need a pre-departure test. Get a PCR if you do get COVID when you're abroad. Just make sure you check everything properly. With all your documents, I would save them on your phone as a PDF and print them out if you can. So that's your vaccine certificate, your fit to fly test if you need a pre-departure test, and any passenger declaration form you might have to do before you fly. In terms of the illness itself, if you're wondering what it was like, for me it was fairly mild, like nothing like flu. It wasn't debilitating or anything. It was just tiredness. Like for a few days my lungs felt weird, and I just got pain in random places, like my hands would suddenly hurt and then my chest would hurt. It was just quite sort of odd, and a bit of a cough. And then the tiredness really lasted for a good kind of week and a half. I'd be fine, and then suddenly just have to lie down. I just couldn't sit up anymore. But then weirdly, at about almost the 10-day mark, I suddenly got worse symptoms and went like really phlegmy, got a bad throat again, and just could hardly speak. It was really annoying because I was supposed to go for dinner with a friend. Like the first day I was out of isolation, I had to cancel just because I couldn't really speak. So I only got to go out for one lunch with my friends, and that was it. And then the next day I had to cancel some other friends because that's when my positive test came back, and I had to spend the day just sorting it all out. I'm not really tired anymore, just like a little bit of lung irritation, just occasionally have to cough, like if I breathe in all the way. Like if I breathe in hard, I can feel like irritation in my lungs. Also my voice is going a bit now. Let me know in the comments if you've flown recently, or if you're gonna fly, or if you're nervous about flying, or let me know your experiences. And please like and subscribe for more videos on life in Australia. Thanks for watching. So the next thing I did was went and got a... Blaine? Hey. Blaine. No waffle. Hey. That's enough.